extracurricular activities in primary and secondary schools across Nigeria have been picking up since last week and will even get busier tomorrow, this week, after the long vacation. For many parents and guardians preparing their children for the new academic session, the development carries with it a certain sense of foreboding against the backdrop of the unpredictable state of insecurity around the country. The Federal Ministry of Education has given assurances, but are the fears and reservations of the parents justified? Dr. Kabir Adamu is a security expert and policy analyst, and he joins us now. Good to have you on the program, Dr. Kabir Adamu. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure, Dr. Abati. Good evening.
Thank you very much. Well, the Minister of State for Education, Goodluck Opiah, at an event in the last week, said that the federal government wants to reassure all Nigerian parents that the schools in Nigeria, from the north to the south, will be safe for students to return to school. Many students are returning to school tomorrow morning. Can we put any faith in that reassurance? Should we trust the Minister of State for Education, the Federal Ministry of Education, the federal government of Nigeria, that our schools will indeed be safe under what they call the Safe School Initiative?
Once again, thank you, Dr. Abati. That statement coming from the Minister of State for Education, at best, I would say is an aspiration. And this is with a huge sense of responsibility, knowing very well that we have transited from the Safe School Initiative into the Safe School Declaration, and then now we have a national policy on safety, security, and violence-free schools in Nigeria. That policy was launched in 2021, and it has an implementation component. And as far as I know, that implementation is yet to commence. Among the various stakeholders that are meant to work towards the implementation of that policy includes the federal government, the Ministry of Education, the ministries of state education in the various states, our civil society organizations and development partners, and then the various security departments, including the military. Now, I'm not aware that we have begun the implementation of that document. In the statement by the Minister of State, he did indicate that the framework for the implementation as well as the mobilization of stakeholders would also begin. So to that extent, I think it's work in progress. It's good that we've put so much energy into developing that document. Then I'm hoping that we're going to see as much energy towards the mobilization of those stakeholders so that the implementation can take place. I'm also aware that as part of the implementation framework, and there is a very strong monitoring and evaluation component. So we're waiting to see how that component is going to play out, so that what we would see is a measured approach to the implementation of the policy that would allow people like you, the media, to assess in a very transparent manner the level of implementation of that document. But for now, it is just an aspiration. We're yet to implement fully that document. And so our schools, unfortunately, still remain vulnerable. We can't discuss that vulnerability perhaps in the course of our conversation.
Well, Dr. Adamu, are you saying to Nigerian parents that they should not believe what the Minister of State for Education has said categorically? Knowing that security in schools, safety of the schools was a major problem. And the Nigerian government has been talking about that. Now, in fact, that minister is putting together an event to celebrate the International Day of Safety of Nigerian schools. So parents, what do you say to parents? We should panic. We should just not trust this.
In simple terms, I'm telling parents to interrogate statements like that. There are components of that statement that are, real and justified. We can hold on to them, but there are also components that we need to interrogate. What I would ask each parent who is listening to this is reach out to the school in question that policy that I mentioned affects both public and private school. So reach out to the school and ask the school, what security plan do you have in place for protecting my child or my ward? If you are presented with a security plan, and that security plan has 4 components, and I'll quickly mention those components. The component to deter a would-be adversary, the component to delay, the component to detect a would-be adversary, and then a component to respond to that adversary if the adversary attempts to enter the school. Then you can rest assured that the school has an arrangement to protect your ward. If they don't have that, then your ward is vulnerable, and you should strongly, I recommend, consider removing your child from that school. Anything short of this, unfortunately, would lead to a level of, I would say, nonchalance from a parent who does not interrogate this level of, because frankly, like I mentioned earlier on, there are vulnerabilities within our environment, and the schools would need to present to parents the way they are managing those vulnerabilities. I have worked with several schools, so I know a lot of schools have gone far in the implementation of some component of this policy, but several others are not even aware of the existence of that policy.
Okay, you are a security expert. You've worked on this issue. In parts of the country, over 600,000 of schools have been shut down. Even in the Federal Capital Territory, at a point, schools had to be shut down. Now, from your knowledge of the situation, what are those specific things that you think would need to be done, both at the federal and state levels, and even by owners of private schools?
Well, we have to divide this into several. There are responsibilities that are government responsibilities. Then there are other responsibilities that have to do with the school. And all of this is captured under the policy. It sees the various stakeholders and it apportions responsibility to them. Parents too also have a responsibility. So if you are not an active member of the PTA in your school, then frankly you are shaking to an extent your responsibility. I also mentioned the need to interrogate the provisions by the school. That too should be something that parents would do. But in terms of advice, number one, starting with government. Because education is in the concurrent list, this is a responsibility that would be shared by both federal government and the state government. So for instance, the implementation of this policy, included in that requirement of the policy is the need to ensure that each school has at least a perimeter fencing. I mentioned the 4 components of the layers of security, as it were. Without fencing, providing fences in school, then frankly, none of those layers would be able to work. So if first thing to do is to conduct an audit. How many schools do have fences and how many don't have? I'm not aware that that audit has been done. There is a claim, and I use that word carefully, by the civil defense that they have conducted a survey of all schools in Nigeria to determine how many have fences and how many don't. Now, they've been asked severally to make that document available. They have not made it available. Again, maybe the Ministry of Education has that type of data, but that data is not yet publicly available. So that's number one. Let's ensure that all our schools are fenced. There is a perimeter fencing of some kind that stops it. Number two is to make sure the components within the school, the academic staff, the non-academic staff, pupils, are aware of the security requirements within the environment. What are the threat factors within that environment? What measures do they need to implement to reduce the risk associated with those threat factors? So each of these components would have to be trained. And I must also say that all of this is contained in the policy. So it's just about implementation. Then number three is the role of also with government now, of our security departments. In places like Borno, some schools are being occupied by the military, as an example. I am hoping that this has been corrected, but the last time I did the check, there were still schools that were being occupied. That policy says our security department must vacate all schools. The fourth component also of the government responsibility is how do they reach out to the threat elements within our environment to ensure that even in conflict situations, they do not touch schools. Now that is a very tall order because one of those threat elements within the environment is outrightly against formal education, especially Western education. So again, it's something that is contained in that policy. How to achieve it it's going to be a very difficult thing, but we must work hard to achieve that element. So that's how I think for each level, including the school, for the school administrations, there are 3 components to a good security measure. The physical component, the systems that would have to be put in place, and then the people that they will employ. All of this would have requirements, and as if I engage with the schools, these are the things I look at. Time would not allow me to go into each of those components, but a layered approach to security requires that these 3 components would have to be in place in every school if you are going to reduce the risk of vulnerability. I've talked about the parents. Then the last component is the community that is hosting the school. All the threat factors that we look at come from the community. So there is also a component within that policy that has to do with the host community. So perhaps during the implementation of that policy, the host community will understand their role towards, first of foremost, identifying those threat elements and then making sure that that threat element does not affect the school. In conclusion, this policy and its implementation has to do with a collaboration and coordination between all of these components that I've mentioned. So if I go back to my earlier statement that this is work in progress, we're yet to see any platform or forum where all of these things, all of these various layers that I've mentioned brought together to understand their various rules.
Okay, Dr. Adamu, just before I let you go, 2 events occurred last week. The ministries came together. Ministry of Interior Affairs, Ministry of Information and Culture, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Police Affairs, all represented by their ministers. And they said, well, they already got a message from President Muhammadu Buhari that by December, terrorism should be completely crushed in Nigeria, and that they are working towards that. One of the ministers told us that, in fact, with regard to security challenges in Nigeria, the worst is over. So I ask you, is the worst over? The other event that took place was the meeting of the intelligence agencies, meeting at the headquarters of the Department of State Security. And their focus was terrorism financing. And they too said, oh, look, that's the target going forward. So really, both of them tied together, is the worst over? And can anybody crush terrorism by December in Nigeria?
Just like I responded when you referred to the Minister of State for Education, these two I would see it as an aspiration. As someone who has his ears and eyes on the ground, I would say a lot happened after the Kuje incident. It was a wake-up call for, frankly, the government and officials. After that incident, of course, you will recall that in July, there were 3 National Security Council meetings. I can't remember really in the history of Nigeria when, especially under the Fourth Republic, when 3 Security Council meetings held in 1 month. And in one of such meetings, there was a presidential directive telling the security forces, the military in particular, to go after the bad elements unhindered. Now, what we saw immediately after that is an increase in security forces operation across the country. And in most of those incidents, there were claims of successes. Several bandit leaders have been killed. Several terrorist leaders, commanders have been killed. But what we unfortunately are yet to see is a reduction in numbers. I run a consultancy. We do keep data of incidents, fatalities, and abduction. And our report is about to come out. And unfortunately, what we've seen between July and August is an increase of about 30%. So from about 500 persons that were killed in July, in August, we recorded about 827 or thereabout. So clearly, that says there's an increase. Now, that does not say that the effort of the security forces is not yielding any fruit. Like I mentioned, they are doing that, but we're yet to see in a coordinated manner the reduction of that. What we're hoping to see in the coming days is the taking over of especially the ungoverned spaces that allow these bandits to hibernate and to grow and carry out the incidents. Until we do that, then unfortunately these things will continue. The second element ties into your second question with regards to the funding of terrorism. It is documented, and I think it's already in the public space, so I can say it. Ransom that is being collected is used to fund the activities of both the bandits and the terrorists, both in Nigeria and outside Nigeria. So that meeting by the DSS is quite instructive, but I would have wished that it was the Attorney General of the Federation that chaired that meeting. Because if you go back to the Gerber report that reviewed our implementation of both international and national policies and requirements on the funding of terrorism, there were several elements of that report that were yet to implement. With all sense of responsibility, our banks still have almost 70% to 80% of contract staff whose loyalty, as it were, and allegiance to those banks are very loose. Through my consultancy in certain kidnap for ransom cases, it is bank staff that actually collude and aid the collection of the money. In Zamfara, we've heard of instances where bullion vans are being taken to forests to collect money, as it were. So all of these are gaps, and like I said, they are contained in a very lucid term within the Gerber report. So I would have hoped that what that meeting did is to review the level of implementation and recommendations as contained in that Gerber report. I didn't see that. So the two are tied together. If we are going to achieve that dream of ending or at least containing terrorism by December, we need to look at both the capability and capacity of these elements to recruit, their capability and capacity to collect ransom, as well as their capability to move around freely. Those motorbikes that they collect that allows them to move freely, they buy fuel to use them. So until we see a coordinated implementation of our national counterterrorism strategy that looks at all these three elements that I see, I unfortunately think that December date would remain a dream.
Well, just before we close this segment of the program, I would like to ask you your comments on the arrest of Tuko Mamu, the negotiator with the terrorists. What do you think the issue really is?
I think with all sense of responsibility, Tuko Mamu entered a territory that he wasn't too familiar with and made several mistakes, actually. I am a trained negotiator, and I believe that several elements and principles of negotiation was abused by him. He wears about 5 caps. He's a journalist. He publishes, as you know. He's also, to an extent, a cleric, his association with Sheikh Gumi. Then he's a mediator, a responsibility that he self-appointed himself, I guess without any training, and perhaps that's why he made those mistakes. Now, the other 2 allegations, and I have reasons based on information available to me that, yes, perhaps those allegations may be correct, that he is a collaborator and that he's also a benefactor. One of the principles of negotiation is that you never ever benefit from the ransom if you are a negotiator. Now, one part of the allegation against him is that he benefited as a collaborator and as a benefactor. The other allegation against him is that a communication was intercepted between him and some terror elements in perhaps in Egypt or some other countries. So it tells me that as a person of interest, the intelligence community in Nigeria may have over time, put him under surveillance, and they may have gathered enough evidence to support the last 2 elements of the caps that I say he wears. And perhaps, and this is what I'm hoping, that a competent court of jurisdiction, all of the evidence that may have been gathered will be presented to a competent court of jurisdiction that would determine whether he's guilty or not. That way, I think Nigerians will look at it from the angle of what he's been accused of. Otherwise, the government could find itself fighting the other 3 caps that he wears. First off, as a religious cleric, and then the media. The media would really pounce on any attempt to, on his rights and all of that. So I think it's very important that all these caps are made distinct and segregated, and the allegation against him presented in a concise and transparent manner.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Kabir Adamu, for joining us on this Day Live, this Sunday Talk Show.